I'm Alan Thorpe.
And I'm David Rogers, and together we host the WeatherPod.
In each episode, we invite a leading expert to help investigate how public, private, and academic sectors can work together to produce weather information of value to business and society.
Timely, accurate, and focused weather information and related services have enormous value across all areas of human activity.
It can increase the efficiency and profitability of business, help save lives and improve safety on land, at sea and in the air, and predict the spread of life-threatening diseases.
Now, as climate change increases the frequency and impact of extreme weather events, weather information is crucial to build social and economic resilience.
In this episode of the WeatherPod, we're delighted to welcome as our guest Tim Palmer following the publication this month of his book, The Primacy of Doubt. Tim is an eminent research scientist in weather and climate prediction and predictability. He's worked at the Met Office, at ECMWF, and at the University of Oxford as a professor of physics. He is well known as the architect of ensemble weather prediction, but he is a polymath with interests that span across fundamental physics and mathematics. Tim's book, The Primacy of Doubt, discusses how incorporating uncertainty appropriately in the form of random noise into simulations and models of a range of natural phenomena, including weather and climate, is fundamental to improving the predictions of future behaviour. And that means, in this case, the weather forecast. Tim, welcome to the WeatherPod.
Hi Tim, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Alan and David. It's great to be here and good to be on the WeatherPod.
Tim, your book covers many areas of science, as indicated by the subtitle, actually, which says from quantum physics to climate change, how the science of uncertainty can help us understand our chaotic world. Today, we're going to focus naturally on the weather and climate themes in your book, which form really the major part of your text.
Yeah, first, if I may, I'd like to say that the book's great. It's a great read from cover to cover, and I particularly like the way you actually personalised it. Many of the issues that gives the reader a kind of a sense of drama of physics, somewhat unusual, not an easy task, but really very well accomplished. I'd like to start with a major theme in your book, which is the idea of chaos. There are references in your book as to whether the weather is predictable given the existence of the property of chaos. Some might find this a strange question, given that meteorologists demonstrated the ability to successfully predict many important aspects of the weather, and indeed do so every day on TV. Of course, the public might confuse unpredictability with the fact that weather can be changeable from one day to the next, or even from 1 hour to the next, but such changes are routinely predicted by weather forecasts with some considerable skill. Do you think we can agree that weather is predictable, at least for many important aspects of the weather over various time ranges?
Well, I don't think that weather is deterministically predictable on any range, actually, whether it's 1 hour ahead, 1 day, 10 days, 10 months, whatever. And it sort of comes back a little bit to essentially work that was done in the 60s, which formed the basis of ECMWF being set up to do, 10-day, 2-week weather forecasts, which was that people like Smagorinsky, Mintz and Arakawa, they did these experiments showing that if you start with two similar states, they will diverge, but they won't completely diverge till a few weeks into the integration. So this led to the idea of what's called a limit of deterministic predictability of maybe 2 or 3 weeks or whatever. The problem is, though, that this is very much an average estimate. And although there are circumstances where we can predict 2 or 3 weeks ahead, there are situations where the weather is not predictable in any deterministic sense, even, a couple of days ahead. And in my book, I go through the famous October 87 storm, which hit southern England. And it kind of depends what you mean by predictable, because the event like the October 87 storm, and these characterize many of the very difficult to predict situations are ones that affect people's lives. These are typically associated with extreme weather. They cause damage and death and so on. And, a typical person in the street would say, well, if you can't predict those systems, then you really aren't predictable. It's a bit like the economy. If you say, is the economy predictable for 6 months ahead, people will quite often say, well, you got the 2008 financial crash completely wrong. And so, oh no, I don't think the economy is predictable. So people judge this question of what's predictable and not predictable, not so much by a kind of an averaged statistic, but by the particular events which affect their lives. And if you can't do a good job for these events which affect people's lives, then you're not doing a good job. So I think that deterministic predictability is a kind of a flawed concept actually on any time scale at all.
I guess that's interesting, Tim. I guess this naturally leads us on to the idea of uncertainty and predictions, as you've said, and as central to your book. I'd like to sort of just pick up on this idea of deterministic predictability first, if I may, and to set the scene. I mean, I suppose the idea is that the goal of weather and climate science is to provide knowledge about the world we live in. And of course, adding knowledge where there was none before is a process you can think of as reducing uncertainty, actually, so that we have an improved understanding. And I guess from the beginning of numerical weather prediction, the idea was that the computer model enshrines the current understanding of the laws of physics as applied to the weather. And it also uses the available observations that are collected globally. And a sort of a way to characterize this process is that a best estimate of the current state of the atmosphere of the weather system is constructed. And it's combined with the best estimate of the physics of the system. And we produce from that the best guess forecast. And that sort of by construction is a single estimate of the future weather. Now, of course, as you pointed out, clearly there may be errors, uncertainties in the process. But it would almost, to me anyway, seem that by construction, this best estimate forecast that comes from our knowledge of the physics and the observations is exactly that. It's the best forecast. I guess you may not agree with this, but I just wanted to see what your reaction was to that kind of thinking.
I think my reaction to that would be that you are conflating the word best in two very different ways. So when we talk about, for example, when we do data assimilation to create a set of initial conditions for a weather forecast, we can say in a certain very precise sense that is a best guess estimate of the initial conditions given the observations and given, if you like, a previous analysis and model forecast from a previous analysis. But the word best there is used in a very technical sense, which is that it kind of minimizes some RMS statistic. It's what a mathematician would call an L2 optimization problem. So you're using the word best there, as I say, in a very specific statistic sense. Now, when you talk about a best forecast, I think that's a much more nuanced. The word is much more nuanced because who is it best for? As I sort of describe in the book, if you have an ensemble where some of the members have severe storms and other members have anticyclones or something, and you average all that together, you'll just get a very bland surface pressure map, which will neither have a severe storm nor a particularly strong anticyclone. Now, technically, if you seek to minimize a kind of an RMS error, one of these L2 norms, then that ensemble average is technically a best forecast. And in some sense, a deterministic forecast is best in that root mean square error sense. But is it best in the sense of providing you knowledge or information about the possibility of a life-threatening storm or something that will do damage if you don't take protective action? And that's where these deterministic forecasts are not best, in my view. And so, as I say, it's conflating, I think, the word best in two completely different scenarios.
I think that's a good and clear explanation. I just wanted to just briefly to pick up on, you use the term deterministic prediction, whereas I use the term a single estimate of the future. Perhaps you could just unpick that. Are those two synonymous, that a deterministic forecast is a single estimate of the future?
Well, traditionally, until ensemble forecasts started to be used, the operational methodology in forecast centers was to rely on the latest single deterministic forecast run from, as you say, best guess initial conditions, and with no estimates of uncertainty in the models. But Chuck Leith, I mean, in my book, I talk about how Chuck Leith was one of the early proponents of ensemble forecasting, what he would call Monte Carlo forecasting. But actually, all he advocated there was that you would actually average the Monte Carlo forecast together to produce a single forecast. And my view is that suffers from exactly the same problems as the deterministic forecast. So any sort of single so-called best guess, which is seeking to minimize a root mean square error, has got all these problems, that it's not really best in the sense of providing useful information to society. So I would sort of combine the two in some sense.
I guess we'll go on later on to talk a bit more about ensemble prediction, but maybe David, you.
So in your book, you make the case that by adding noise, the simulation of the weather is actually made more accurate. But this seems kind of counterintuitive, given that as we were talking about earlier, improving scientific knowledge aims to reduce uncertainty. So could you explain how adding noise can make a simulation more accurate, and just how much noise is enough to optimize the accuracy of a simulation? It would seem intuitive that by adding more and more noise must eventually degrade the quality of the simulation. So how do we know when to stop?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, let me just give you, the background to this was that when we started operationally running the ensemble in 1992. But it was clear pretty much from the start that the ensembles were not producing adequate representations of uncertainty in the tropics. So typically, the truth would lie outside the ensemble, particularly in the tropics. And no amount of fiddling around with the initial conditions would change that. So it was kind of obvious, in a way, I think, to all of us that there was some that we weren't properly representing the uncertainty in the model equations themselves. So we introduced this notion of stochastic parameterization, where you essentially add noise to the subgrid parameterizations, and that had a really big influence. I often joke with I say this in a slightly lighthearted way, but to my deterministic colleagues that the amount of lines of code that were added were really rather small, but they absolutely radically they improved the prediction timescale of forecasts in the tropics by several days. So which could often take a decade of work to, traditionally. So the amount of bang per line of code, I think, has never been greater with the stochastic addition to the model. Now, what we found was that when we ran the model in a kind of longer climate mode, this noise was actually helping to reduce some of the systematic errors in the model, which was somewhat surprising. We did work on weather regimes, which had an impact, things like hurricanes. And actually, just this week, I've been at a workshop at ECMWF where Judith Berner from NCAR was showing how the statistics of El Nino in the NCAR community climate model is radically improved with stochastic parameterization. And this is kind of surprising in a way, because the noise is injected, the time scale for the noise is just a matter of a day or two, whereas this is impacting on, seasonal and longer time scale statistics of El Nino. Anyway, so kind of what's going on, and I would say the answer is basically this, that the reality of the matter is we're dealing with this Navier-Stokes equation, this very complex nonlinear partial differential equation, which couples together scales of motion right through the spectrum of the atmosphere and ocean, from the jet stream meanders right down to gusts of wind behind trees and small mountains and such like. And when we truncate the equations, we're at whatever it is, 100 kilometers for a climate model or 10 kilometers for a weather model. We're doing damage to those scale interactions. We're kind of violating one of the actual symmetry properties of the Navier-Stokes, which is this scale, what's called scale invariance. So adding noise actually helps to, you're basically adding noise at the truncation scale of the model. It just helps to smooth, to some extent, to smooth over that brick wall that you introduce when you do a hard truncation. And you basically, because with a truncation, basically you're removing all of the kind of fluctuations in the atmosphere on subgrid levels. And that's doing damage to the equation. So I think you can understand from that point of view why adding noise can be helpful. And there are many nonlinear systems, and I discuss some of this in my book, where adding noise can be beneficial. People who are familiar in audio recordings know about the potential positive role of noise called dithering. No, okay, yeah, you're right. You can't add noise ad infinitum. At some stage, you're right. It starts to degrade the system, and it's a judicious balance. And of course, what we would really like to do is to have good diagnostics from very high resolution models that could be used to determine what is the correct physical level of noise. I don't think we're quite there yet, so we're doing it in a slightly more sort of empirical way. But I think there's very little doubt that noise to some extent is beneficial and alleviates some of the not all, but some of the shortcomings of a sort of highly truncated model.
I guess I'm still a little bit confused about this, in the sense that, the parameterizations themselves are there specifically to represent the transfers of energy, momentum, etc., from the unresolved scales to the resolved and back again. So in a sense, that's their job. And what you're saying seems to me to be saying that they're not good enough at doing that, and noise kind of gives them a kick up the backside to actually do that transfer more effectively. But I suppose the difficult thing to get your head around is, why does noise do that? It sort of, you'd think you'd need some more I don't know, this sounds a bit pejorative, but a more scientifically intricate way of representing the transfers rather than just adding noise.
Well, you have to make judgments about the form of the noise, like whether it's additive noise or multiplicative noise, and you have to make judgments about the spatiotemporal correlations of the noise from one time step to another, or from one grid box to the neighboring grid box, and those judgments, encompass some of the physics of the situation. But basically this kind of scaling invariance in the Navier-Stokes equations gives rise to what are called power law distributions of energy, which are very ubiquitous in nonlinear systems. They apply to the economy, to biological systems, and so on. And it just means that as you in the case of the atmosphere and the oceans, as you go from smaller and smaller scales, the amount of energy is kind of decreasing in some sense slowly. Now, the whole concept of a parametrization, on the other hand, is based on the notion that, for example, if it's for convection, that within your within your grid box, you have a very large ensemble of convective clouds, from which you can meaningfully derive some statistical bulk kind of behavior. On the other hand, with this power law distribution, if you actually look at what happens, you go out in the real world, look at satellite data or something, you don't see this. You often, I mean, in the active areas of convection, you see organized convective systems on scales which are, a bit smaller, but not dramatically smaller than your grid box. And then you see, smaller systems yet going right down to, individual small cumulus clouds, if you like. So you have this spectrum of scales. And actually, the tendency of the time rate of change in a grid box is actually determined by those small numbers of highly organized, if you like, mesoscale convective systems, which aren't small compared to the grid box. They're on this sort of similar scale. So the whole concept, the whole philosophy of parametrization breaks down in that sense. And noise, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's not a complete panacea, and if we come on to high resolution modeling, and I'll tell you that. But it's better than the status quo, which is just assuming you can just parameterize these subgrid scales like as if it was a diffusive set of diffusion or viscosity for molecules. It doesn't work like that.
Just so that our listeners are clear, when you use the word noise, what does that actually mean in terms of what is actually added? Is it? It's obviously to do with sound, obviously, but
that's a great question. I mean, we actually use what would be called pseudo-random number generators to sort of perturb the existing stochastic parameterizations. So when you run an ensemble, and you focus on a particular grid box, each member of the ensemble would have a different different representation, say, of the convective parameterization perturbed by this pseudo-random number generator. Right. Now, it's my long-term ambition that we actually use noise generated in hardware, actually by the electrons flowing through the transistors in a computer to produce the noise, because that would actually make the whole stochastic computation cheaper. We would save energy doing that. I think we're kind of wasting energy by running all these pseudo-random number generators in software when we have a perfectly good source of noise inside the actual computer itself, and that would be something I'd love to see happen.
You have a good example in your book with that simulation with using 64-bit and using 16-bit plus randomness, and that's very, very convincing.
Yeah, I mean, noise, we often think rather linearly about noise, that it's a nuisance, something to be got rid of. But once you start dealing with nonlinear systems, there are many, many, many examples. I mean, I cut out from the book because I was just going on too long about the theory of ice ages. The notion of stochastic resonance, as it's called, is a mechanism for boosting the perturbations due to orbital fluctuations, which otherwise would just be too small to do anything, to the Earth's climate. So it interacts with the inherent noise in the atmosphere to boost that orbital signal. And that's believed to be, one of the key reasons why we have ice ages. So, there are just so many examples out there where in a nonlinear system, noise can actually be your friend. It's a constructive thing. But as you say, David, to a degree, obviously there comes a stage where if it becomes so dominant, then it ultimately then destroys the system.
Tim, you've touched, and we've touched in this conversation about ensemble forecasting, and I know that many people will be aware of what that is in essence, and you've been a pioneer of ensemble forecasting for many years, including at ECMWF, where, for example, 50 or more members or parallel forecasts are made. I wonder, just briefly, could you just to make sure we're all on the same page, just outline the philosophy behind the ensemble approach that's used these days?
Well, it comes back to our initial discussion about predictability, that when we look at the weather, and this is again true of pretty much any nonlinear system, so it's not specific to weather. And in my book, I show other examples, including the motion of planets in the solar system, where things can be very seemingly predictable and well behaved for long periods of time, but then can go through periods of unpredictability. So predictability, the whole concept is that predictability is not a fixed quantity in a system, it's a variable. It's just as variable as the weather is itself. You should think of predictability as like temperature and rainfall and wind and so on. It's just another variable. But the point is that if you know ahead of time this predictability, it just helps you make better decisions. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is help people whose lives and businesses and so on depend on the weather make better decisions, either better business decisions or better, decisions about life-threatening situations and so on. And an ensemble, basically because it turns what is an unreliable forecast system, the deterministic forecast system is unreliable because it goes wrong when the system is unpredictable, into a reliable prediction system. So the ensemble tells you when this is going to be a difficult situation to predict and where you need to hedge your bets or whatever it is. It tells you that ahead of time. So it's basically making an unreliable system into a reliable system. I would add, as a scientist, it's making an unscientific approach to meteorology into a scientific approach. If you can't estimate uncertainty, then you're not really doing science. Being able to put error bars on predictions is a hallmark of science. Otherwise, you're no better than astrologists in predicting, that you're going to meet a tall, dark stranger in a dark alley or something.
We can follow up on that. So the one problem, of course, about ensembles is that they're computationally expensive, and they present forecasters and end users with greatly increased volumes of data. Now, there are also, and I think you've suggested it also, that we could use machine learning and AI to speed up the process of ensemble generation and eliminate need for multiple full simulations. What do you think about this possibility?
Well, we need to be very cautious, I think. Let me just say one thing, first of all. When you say they're expensive, the expense of an ensemble scales linearly with the number of ensemble members. And, in these days of massively parallel computing, ensemble forecasting is a rare example of what's sometimes called embarrassingly parallel problem. So it really is parallel, super parallel. So actually, ensemble forecasting makes really good use of massively parallel types of machines. And compared with the expense of increasing resolution, I don't think ensemble forecasting is particularly expensive. But let me just come on to AI, because I think there's a really, really, really important point here. As a general rule of thumb, I would say AI is super good at interpolating between data, but super, super, super bad at extrapolating from data. I would never advocate using AI to make predictions of climate change in the future, because the whole question, for example, of climate change will depend on things like how CO2 affects El Nino events and other types of phenomena, how it affects cloud cover, about which we have no idea from existing data. So training an AI system to make a reliable prediction of climate change 50 or 100 years from now is, I think, a very kind of misguided thing to do. And similarly, if I have an ensemble of 50 members, I think there is a really great role for AI to fill that out, to make that into a 50,000 member ensemble with much improved estimates of probability. And indeed, I've written, for WMO advocating that we should use AI to do downscaling rather than using limited area models, which I think is just is going to be a very poor second to AI. On the other hand, thinking that you can just take a deterministic forecast and somehow from that use AI to tell you whether this is going to be predictable or unpredictable. In other words, to extrapolate the structure of, just to be mathematical, it's the structure of the climate attractor, in the neighborhood of that single trajectory. I think that is to me implausible. At least, that it would do as good a job as an ensemble. You're asking it to kind of extrapolate from a single trajectory out to a kind of a neighborhood of state space, as I say, if I can be mathematical for a second. And that's an extrapolation problem. And as I say, I think that's where AI fails, essentially. By the way, I should say early on in the days, when I first joined ECMWF, before we got the ensemble going, we did quite a lot of work. I did this with Stefano Tebaldi and Franco Molteni, trying to see if we could forecast, the buzz phrase was forecast the forecast skill. What could we tell from the structure of the deterministic forecast that would allow you to predict from that single deterministic forecast whether it was going to be a skillful forecast or an unskillful forecast? And the answer is you can say a little bit, but not enough that's going to be useful in any sense. And I'm very skeptical that AI could do better than that. But I really do think AI has a great role to play in taking a kind of a skeleton of ensemble members, a skeleton of 50 ensemble members, and filling that out to produce an ensemble of, as I say, 50,000. Now, you're right to say the issues are how do you deal with all the data? Of course, that's a really important question, but I think that's secondary, if you like, to the matter of principle.
Tim, I'd like us to move on to, you've mentioned this already a little bit, but in the book you talk about, in a sense, a law of diminishing returns regarding our improvement in skill by increasing the resolution, the spatial resolution, the detail in weather models. So just to set against that for a second, if we look back at the history of numerical weather prediction, in a sense, our skill of forecasts have sort of advanced almost in lockstep with increasing the resolution, from the early days when a weather model had 200 kilometre by 200 kilometre squares to now, almost, 9 kilometre by 9 kilometre squares. So in a sense, we're used to that progression, if you like. And the other thing is that the distance we can forecast into the future has advanced, but it's still quite a way away from the 2-week limit, if it is indeed a limit, that people talk about and you mention. And even at 9 kilometres by 9 kilometres, the grid square is still not, in a sense, providing the detail that individual people or even groups of people require to really understand the impact of the weather on them. So are we really entering a period of diminishing returns relative to resolution, or are we still a bit of a long way away from that limit?
Okay. I hope I didn't, I have to go back and see exactly what I wrote, but I hope I didn't say that we were entering a period of diminishing returns in a general sense. So let me be specific. I was referring, there's a chapter in the book where I talk about Lorenz's famous 1969 paper. Well, I say famous, it's actually not as famous as his 1963 paper, but the 1969 paper where he presents this extraordinary, I think, concept that there may be a finite limit to the predictability of a deterministic system which has many scales. So I kind of go through that, and the implications are that if you want to forecast the detailed evolution of weather, then there may well be a limit around, let's call it around 2 weeks. Exactly what it is, I don't know, 2 to 3 weeks, let's say. But that is not to say that the whole kind of weather forecasting enterprise is itself reaching a kind of a law of diminishing returns. And I don't believe that for one moment. For example, let me just say two particular things. This limit of two to 3 weeks, whatever it is only a kind of an average limit. There will be occasions where the predictability of the system extends beyond that, just as there are situations where it's short of that. Of course, we need ensembles to be able to tell when we're in a situation where the predictability is extended, and of course when it's shorter. So that will effectively extend the limit of predictability, because we'll be able to tell in advance when we're in super predictable situations. But just focusing, you see, I still think we have a long way to go still in predicting even a week ahead. And I just want to give you an example. This was very vivid memory of a few years ago. I was at a workshop in Australia, actually, where we were talking about extreme weather prediction. And a colleague of mine showed, we were actually talking about the flooding in southern India, in Gujarat. Is it good? Sorry, I've forgotten the name of the province now. But anyway, in southern India, it'll come to me in a minute, where there'd been really devastating flooding a year before this workshop. And a colleague from ECMWF was showing the ensemble prediction. He was very proud. He said, look, 7 days ahead, there was a clear probabilistic signal of a 2 sigma rainfall event over southern India. And the Indian colleague said, he just kind of laughed. He was in the audience, just laughed at this. And we looked over him, why are you laughing? And he said, nobody would notice a 2 sigma event. This flooding was a 15 sigma event. Nobody would get out of bed for a 2 sigma event, And I think, we in our NWP centers sometimes sort of, we kind of forget that real extreme events are much more extreme than models can often actually simulate. And we apply all sorts of post-processing software, comparing an event against the model's climatology in order to kind of boost that signal. But the fact of the matter is we've got a long way to go to get really important severe events right, even a week ahead of time.
And is resolution one of the routes to getting those better predictions?
Absolutely, resolution is one of the routes. Now, I mean, I was always a big kind of, I kind of resisted increases in resolution when we didn't have an ensemble, because I said, having an increased resolution model when you have no idea whether you're producing something that's reliable or unreliable is not scientific. But now we do have ensembles, and I'm the biggest fan of high resolution models, basically because high resolution means you're solving the laws of physics more accurately. So okay. Absolutely, and for climate change, I think it's vital we have much higher resolution models than we have now.
I'm glad we've cleared that up, actually, because it was obviously I wasn't quite getting the right end of the stick with what you were saying.
But it's not, I mean, to me, it's not totally clear, because you also, if given that many countries are stuck on determinism as the holy grail, and high resolution of a deterministic model, and I think you point out that you're just simply propagating even more errors if you go down that path. So it's important to make this big distinction between resolution of an ensemble and resolution of something that you don't believe is a very reliable forecasting system in the first place, which is a deterministic one.
That's right. I'd like to, yeah. So David, I completely agree with you. And, I think one of the really, really exciting developments in our field in the last few years has been this program of what's called anticipatory action, where humanitarian and disaster relief agencies and so on they go in ahead of time when the probabilities exceed some predetermined threshold. So this is a great use of ensemble forecasting. It tells you, it gives you an objective criterion for when it makes sense to take precautionary action and when it doesn't. And I think that there is a big role for the national Met services to advance this science, but it's not through trying to make the forecasts more deterministic. That's really the wrong way to go. Now, I understand, when national Met services, particularly in developing countries, they don't have big computer resources. They may feel that the best use of their resources is to just create a single deterministic limited area model or something like that, and assume that's the best. I think that, we talked about AI. I think this is where AI can really transform the whole way in which national Met services work, in taking the global ensemble data and downscaling it using AI, using, by the way, their own their own local observational networks to do the training for the AI system. This is actually a great use of national observing capabilities that perhaps otherwise are not made best use of. So instead of running a single or a small number of limited area models, they can probabilistically downscale the global ensembles, and then that data then can be given to the various disaster agencies, national or international agencies, to do this fantastic job of determining when to take anticipatory action, how to make best use of the limited funding that these agencies have to help people at risk of severe weather. So I think we're at the cusp of potentially what could be a major change in the way in which we work, as a kind of a meteorological society interfacing with
this underlines, in a way, a really important point, and that is about international cooperation, because when you say the global ensembles, somebody has to produce those, which are typically a subset of the developed countries, and that information needs to get to the developing countries effectively and be used effectively in the ways you've described. And it sort of takes what I think we're all pretty proud of, which is how cooperative the weather enterprise is, but it takes it to another level, actually, of connectivity and cooperation, which we shouldn't necessarily take for granted, because there are challenges in getting that cooperation to be effective, as I'm sure David would underline.
Yeah, and I think I totally agree with what you've said, but I feel that there's still something that's missing in how persuasive we are with a lot of countries who are, they're receiving resources from outside, whether it be the World Bank or other development partners, and a lot of them are just simply thinking about buying a modest scale high performance computer, focusing on the traditional and not really picking up on really where the advances are. And this notion of, I hear this very often, the ECMWF model is only at this resolution, therefore we'll use it to run our deterministic model. And it's like, no, it's, how can we be more persuasive about this? I mean, it seems critical, right? Right now, a lot of money goes into the wrong things as a result of not essentially understanding what the problem is and how to address it.
Well, I think there are two things here. One is to say that at the level of the scientists in these Met services, there is fantastic science to be done, interfacing AI-based code, generative adversarial networks, and all this kind of really sexy modern data science, interfacing that with the global NWP output. I think this is really exciting science that should sort of stimulate anyone, working on this. And I mean, dare I say it? I mean, if you become an expert in AI, you are very marketable around the world. So this is good for you, and it's good for the science, and it's everyone's a winner. For the directors of the Met services, I just say this, that as I say, it provides them with a real new type of rationale for going to government to maintain their observing systems. The fact of the matter is that ECMWF, the major source of data for ECMWF are the satellites, and it's hard to make use of, regional radar and local weather observations. But it's these radars and weather observations, local observations, that are going to be absolutely critical for the AI training process in doing that downscaling. So it provides the directors with a kind of rationale for keeping their budgets and potentially expanding their budgets. And of course, the training and running the AI will need computers. They won't need the biggest supercomputers in the world, but they'll need computers of some sort. So, it's just taking national Met services, moving them into the 21st century in terms of basic science, but also providing then the basic tools for making much better decisions for farmers, for hydrologists, for health workers, and of course for disaster preparedness agencies. So it's absolutely win-win-win all the way through.
Thanks, Tim. So as we come to a close, one of the major developments in meteorological prediction that you touch on in your book is the idea of a digital twin of planet Earth. Could you give us a kind of brief update on what the idea is with digital twins and how they differ from the global weather and climate models that we're used to?
Well, I think the basic idea here is that, weather is sort of an intermediary for most of the important decisions that, people make in their lives. It could be if the river is flooding, the rainfall is obviously a major input, but ultimately the decision is based on whether the river floods or not. And if you're, predicting a malaria outbreak, the important decisions will be in the malaria, how much the malaria incidence will go up. It's affected by the rain and the temperature, but those are intermediate. So a digital twin is trying to combine these impact models into the kind of weather and climate, into a much more integrated way. And I think, by the way, this will help alleviate some of the data problems, because if you can combine the impact models into the code, then the requirements for storing all the meteorological ensemble data actually become less, because you're making use of that on the fly. So actually, the whole digital twin is really trying. And by the way, I think I'm looking forward to the day when what are called agent-based models of the economy are built into our weather and climate models, so we can actually have estimates of how local economies are going to be affected by weather extremes and changes in climate. So it's kind of an exciting future. It's a more integrated future. We'll be much less siloed into our disciplines and much more interdisciplinary, which I think is a good thing. And we're moving slowly towards it.
Well, Tim, this has been a really fascinating conversation that we've had, and I really want to thank you both for the book and also for joining us as a guest on this episode of the WeatherPod.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. It's been really interesting and great to discuss the fundamentals, how we can basically predict the evolution of the weather and climate and predict predictability. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much indeed.
Well, that concludes this episode of the WeatherPod. We hope you've enjoyed it. Alan and I will be back next month, and in the meantime, please give us your feedback via email to support@gweforum.org.